Hey Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We do all manner of dorkly things here, whether it be sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another one of our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. This one actually was inspired by a comment to my Blue Wizards video. Someone commenting in that mentioned Radagast the Brown and kind of theorized as to what might be Radagast's fate in Lord of the Rings. That's a really cool topic, and I thought, why not do a video on that? So today we're going to talk about Radagast the Brown. Okay, so just to fill you in, now Radagast shows up a lot in the Hobbit movies, does not show up in the Lord of the Rings movies. And his appearance in the books is pretty limited, although we do get a little bit more of him, information about him from some of the unfinished tales and some of the other letters that Tolkien wrote and such. We take it back to early in the Third Age, kind of around the year 1000 or so, across the water in the west, the Valar have decided, you know what, Sauron is not defeated. That War of the Last Alliance didn't completely take him out. He's going to come back. Let's send some emissaries over to help humans and elves handle the threat of Sauron. Okay. And I've covered this in a couple other videos, but it's important for Radagast, so we're talking about it again. So, at this big council, it's decided that 4 wizards should go, and you've got they have other names, but we'll just call them by their most popular name just for clarity. So there's Saruman, and there's Gandalf, and there's the 2 blue wizards. Check out that video, Alatar and Palando. And right at the last moment, one of the spirits, one of the Valar, Yavanna, she's basically the goddess of nature, says, hey, I want you to include a 5th, they're called the Istari, but a 5th wizard, Radagast. And she kind of basically begs to put him push him into the mix. So he's kind of a last second addition. And in some ways, I think the idea is, these folks are dealing with the elves and men, but the nature spirit wants to make sure that, the flora and fauna are looked after as well. So for their interests, you get Radagast. And he arrives at Middle-earth about the same time as Gandalf. Saruman shows up first, then Gandalf and Radagast show up on the shores of Middle-earth. So Radagast sets up, and you hear the name Rhosgobel in the Hobbit movies, but that's his house. So Rhosgobel is on the western edge of Mirkwood, and it's kind of a dangerous place in the Third Age, right? It's pretty close to Dol Guldur, where Sauron originally takes up residence, and then eventually you've got Kabul. The Nazgul takes up residence. Anyway, it's a dangerous place, and it's not that far away from Orthanc and Saruman, who obviously gets corrupted as well. So it's a dangerous spot to set up shop, but it's also on the edge of a very large forest, and that was at least part of Radagast's reasoning. I think part of it was keep an eye on Sauron. That was his job, supposedly, and Sauron is right there in Dol Guldur, not that far away. And it's also, he can tend to the flora and fauna of what turned into Mirkwood. It had originally been Greenwood, and with Sauron's presence, it had corrupted the wildlife and the flora there. And so again, you could see reasons why someone who's supposed to be looking after the flora and fauna might show up at the woods that are being corrupted by Sauron. Makes sense. So, we know a couple of things about Radagast from the books. So one is that, he's not that far away as well from Beorn, who's in The Hobbit. He's the person that can turn into a bear. And Gandalf and the company of dwarves stay with Beorn temporarily, meet with him. And Radagast is mentioned at that point. He's name dropped, essentially. And Beorn says, I believe, that he has met Radagast and that he's not bad for a wizard, which I think is a pretty big compliment probably from Beorn. It's about as good a compliment as you're going to get. Not bad, because he doesn't like a lot of things. So the fact that Radagast had some kind of a rapport with Beorn is interesting. And maybe relevant to one of my theories for perhaps what happened after the War of the Ring for Radagast. So that's really the only real mention of him in The Hobbit. Lord of the Rings comes around, and in the Fellowship of the Ring, there's a pretty pivotal scene where Radagast meets Gandalf on the road near the Shire. And it's Radagast who says, hey, Gandalf, Saruman is requesting your presence at Orthanc at Isengard. You should go immediately. And by the way, there are Nazgul, out and about, and they know to look for the Shire. And so there's Nazgul around, and you need to go meet with Saruman right away. Then Gandalf says something to Radagast, which turns out to be very important for him and for the story. Gandalf says, "Hey, great! I'll go see Saruman. Send your eagles to scout, and have the eagles report back to Saruman and myself back at Orthanc." So obviously, Gandalf shows up at Orthanc. I say Isengard, Orthanc, whatever. We'll say Isengard because that's the more popular term. So they show up at Isengard, and we learn that Saruman was basically using Radagast as a go-between dupe. He really doesn't think highly of Radagast at all. Calls him Radagast the Simple, Radagast the Fool. And he had sent Radagast on this journey to find Gandalf because he figured Gandalf would probably maybe be more likely to show up and be not on his guard because Radagast had invited him. So Saruman imprisons Gandalf, obviously, at the top of the tower. But when Gwaihir the eagle comes to the tower to report his findings, he sees Gandalf and obviously rescues Gandalf, and that's how that happens. So kind of indirectly, Radagast both imprisons Gandalf and saves Gandalf. And so that's kind of the Radagast's part in all this. Is he's kind of an unwitting guy. It seems like, I believe Tolkien wrote that, like each of these wizards, other than Gandalf, failed in their mission to, defend against Sauron, right? And that's, if you watch the Blue Wizards video, that's kind of what I talked about. Like, how did the Blue Wizards fail? They had their own failings. Saruman had his failing, which he tried to use the ring for his own ends, and kind of a similar lust for power thing. And so it's described as maybe a lesser failing, but that Radagast failed because he kept his focus on plants and animals and kind of missed the picture of, stayed away from humans and elves, and so didn't aid them as much as he could have in the moment. And so kind of an odd way to fail in his mission. But you could also argue perhaps he didn't fail in his mission, because if Yavanna was the one that offered him up for the mission, perhaps in some ways that was his actual mission, was to look after the creatures and the flora that she cared about. But ultimately, it's only Gandalf that succeeded in this. And there's a poem in Unfinished Tales that specifically mentions that of the 5 wizards who went east, only one came back. And so that would be Gandalf. We know Gandalf came back, so there's the one guy. So we get the idea that Radagast did not come back. And you would think at least part of that reason might be because his mission was not successful, in his mind. But we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So, one more thing about Radagast from the books, and that is at the Council of Elrond, the elves send out scouts to Rhosgobel to find him. Like, he's going to be kind of important for this upcoming war. We could use him. Scouts show up at his house and report that he is not there. Now, they don't report, oh, and the place was torched and overrun. So it just could be that he was out and about. But interestingly, it's Gandalf who says that it was odd. Like, he's not the traveling sort. That it must have been something very important to get him out of his house, out of Rhosgobel. So the fact that he's not the traveling sort and yet he's missing from his house is kind of like a little dire thing there. That, you know, I think some have theorized that perhaps he was killed off, either by Sauron's forces or maybe Saruman. I doubt Saruman would have done it, but some thought maybe out of revenge for accidentally saving Gandalf. I don't think Saruman bumped off Radagast. And I feel like if Sauron had done in Radagast, we would have heard about it. I think that's a pretty significant thing if one of the wizards got killed off. So I just think that for whatever reason, maybe he felt there was a danger to his home or something. He just wasn't there. He had cleared out to be safe. There is an interesting line that Gandalf uses to describe Radagast when he's talking at the council. And here, I have the passage right here. It's pretty telling, actually. So what Gandalf says. He says, Radagast is, of course, a worthy wizard, a master of shapes and changes of hue, and he has much lore of herbs and beasts, and birds are especially his friends. So obviously the eagles, friends of his, and that works out. But it's that line where he says he's a master of shapes and changes of hue. Now that seems to me to mean that he is maybe an illusionist, that he can change shape. We don't see any of that, in the books per se, but as a very interesting trait. You wouldn't necessarily associate that with druid who looks after the forest. Is kind of what he is, right? And by the way, he can change shape and change, hue, whatever. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting. It sort of made me think of, like, is there somebody in the books that could have actually been Radagast in disguise? I can't really think of a good, a good target for that. So yes, I think that's the last we hear of Radagast in terms of the War of the Ring, is that he is missing from his house. And I don't think we ever really get any other indication of his presence throughout the war or after. He's left out of the history books, of the Tolkien history books. So, what happened to him? Again, I don't think he died. I think that would be too big a momentous a thing to just leave off the pages. This is somebody who's hanging out. If he's hanging out near Rhosgobel, or if he's hanging out in Mirkwood, he's right in the thick of things. Oh, one thing I should mention, another piece that we do know about him, when the White Council first meets up, and so Saruman kind of, first meets up with Radagast and realizes, like, this guy, I think I can manipulate him. That's what Saruman does, is manipulates people. So he manipulates Radagast to go find Gandalf for him. He also manipulates Radagast to help him try to find the ring. So if you remember, I did a video on the disaster of Gladden Fields. That's where Isildur was killed and the ring was lost. And so many years later, Saruman was like, well, where's the last place we knew where the ring was? Gladden Fields. Gladden Fields happened to be very close to Mirkwood and Rhosgobel. It was actually, again, right next to Radagast's house. So Radagast offers to have his birds and creatures help in the search for the ring in the Gladden Fields area. So he uses their eyes and ears to aid Saruman's search. He doesn't realize Saruman wants to find the ring for himself. So again, he's kind of being duped into helping. But he does the search, and he also uses his creatures as watch animals in case, because Sauron might be searching. He's searching for the ring as well. So in case the enemy is going to be coming, Radagast is using his creatures to patrol the area to make it safe for Saruman's forces to search for the ring. Little did any of them know that many years earlier, Gollum, Sméagol, had stopped by, found the ring, and run off to the Misty Mountains with it, and it was nowhere in the area at all. But just another example of, I suppose you could say that Radagast was a little too naive, a little maybe almost, I don't want to say childlike, but just too innocent in a way to believe that he was being used. And so Saruman saw him as a target and used him in some ways. Okay, so after the war, I have no reason to believe that we don't hear anything about that, like, for instance, Rhosgobel was destroyed or it was turned into something else or whatever. So I'm going to go with the easiest answer is the best, the Occam's razor. I feel like we know that he didn't go west. So he did not either decide to return or maybe he felt he couldn't return, unlike Gandalf. So he stayed in Middle-earth. I feel like he probably stayed at Rhosgobel. Mirkwood was completely rejuvenated after the War of the Ring. It had originally been Greenwood. It was Mirkwood. Then after the war, the wood gets split up into different territories. So in the north, you've got Thranduil and the Wood Elves. In the south, you've got Celeborn. And it's kind of the Celeborn Galadriel from Lothlorien. Well, they take over kind of I think it's the new Lothlorien or Lothlorien, East Lothlorien, something like that. And then kind of in between those zones, of the wood is reserved for the Beorn's folks, the Beornings, which are at that point led by Beorn's son, Grim Beorn. And then there's also the Wildmen. So they get kind of a zone of territory themselves. And the wood is renamed. It's not renamed Greenwood. It's named Wood of Green Leaves. That's a translation. It's an Elvish term, but which I always thought was interesting because that's actually another name for Legolas, right? Legolas translated is Greenleaf, and so this is the Wood of Green Leaves. It's like Legalin or something like that. Anyway, so since obviously Legolas, Thranduil's son, he was the prince of the Woodland Realm. It's kind of interesting that the name ends up having an echo of Legolas's name to it. And it survives well into the Fourth Age. So yeah, I feel like Radagast probably stayed at Rhosgobel, helped the rejuvenation of the former Mirkwood. And it is interesting. I feel like he probably, because the Beornings, that middle zone there that I was talking about between Thranduil and Celeborn, it's kind of right around where Rhosgobel would have been as well, kind of on the western edge of that. So he would have been in pretty good contact with the Beornings. And I feel like of all the people of Middle-earth, he would get along the most with the Beornings. And the reason being, one, they did not hunt birds or any creatures of any kind. They basically ate honey and cream and milk and stuff like that. So they didn't despoil any of the fauna. So that would be something that obviously Radagast would approve of. And the fact that they could shape change, if we take Gandalf, I believe Gandalf when he says he can master of shape changing stuff. So perhaps he even has that in common with them, that as a shape changer, he could he could bond with the Beornings in that way. So I feel like those people, the people of nature who could also shape change, would have been kind of the perfect society for Radagast to at least communicate with, and they happen to be right there next to Rhosgobel. So I'm guessing that's probably how he spent his days after that. There is one note from the books that I read. It's kind of a rumor that perhaps Radagast does show up in the Two Towers. I personally don't think this is true, but I'll explain it anyway just because it's out there and some people talk about this. So in the Two Towers, there's a kind of mysterious scene that never gets fully explained. And it's Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. You know, they're on the hunt for Merry and Pippin, and they're on the edge of the Fangorn forest. And they see a wizard. Essentially, they kind of figure it's a wizard. He's got a cloak, he's got a staff, he's got this big, wide-brimmed hat, kind of pulled down, and this figure that they see doesn't say anything. As they approach, he disappears, and the horses are scared off. And it's kind of mysterious, like who was that? They figure it's either Saruman or Gandalf, although Gandalf, you know, has passed away. So shortly thereafter, they do find Gandalf, the newly returned Gandalf the White, and Gimli asks him, "Hey, was that you back there?" And Gandalf is very specific, says, "Nope, that wasn't me, it must have been Saruman." Okay, so the difference is, though, that this figure did have a wide brim hat, and Saruman was never known to wear a hat. He had a cowl that he would wear, and he didn't wear this hat. And so some have speculated perhaps this wizard figure that disappeared, you know, does have the ability of illusion, was Radagast checking in on the party. I prefer to. I think it's more likely that it just happened to be Saruman, and he was wearing a hat this time, and that, you know, he was checking up on these folks because they were important, and he did scare off the horses. Perhaps that was his mode all along, to try to slow them down by you know, scaring off their mounts. I'm not sure, but anyway, some people have theorized maybe that was Radagast kind of following the party all along, because Tolkien never explicitly states who that was, but the strong implication is that it was Saruman looking in on you know, Aragorn and friends. Anyway, so there you go. That's all I know about Radagast the Brown, who I do feel survived the War of the Ring and lived into the Fourth Age, hanging out in the newly revived Wood of Green Leaves. If you've got a theory about him, what might have become of Radagast the Brown, feel free to put it in the comments. Until next time, everybody. Bye.